The restaurant was alive with noise and movement. Plates clinked, glasses clattered, and the smell of sizzling steak drifted through the air. Waiters weaved between tables like dancers, balancing trays stacked with dishes. Customers laughed over. Wine couples leaned in close, and friends shared stories between bites. It was one of those nights when every table was full, and the staff barely had time to breathe. Ryan, a young waiter with sharp eyes and a quicker mouth, was moving from table to table, taking orders and delivering food. He had worked here for 2 years and knew the place inside out. Ryan was quick, efficient, and had a bit of a reputation, not for being the friendliest waiter, but for being the one who didn't hold back if he thought someone didn't belong. In his mind, the restaurant was classy, and only the right kind of people deserved to eat here. That night, just as Ryan was rushing to drop off a tray of drinks, the glass doors swung open. In walked a man who immediately drew attention, though not in the way Ryan liked. He was huge, tall and broad-shouldered, and dressed casually in a hoodie and sneakers. His clothes were simple, no flashy watch, no expensive suit. He carried himself with an easy calm, his hands in his pockets, like he had all the time in the world. Ryan's eyes flicked up and down the man's frame, and a thought crossed his mind. He doesn't look like our usual crowd. He was used to seeing businessmen in suits, wealthy couples in designer clothes, and well-dressed tourists ready to spend big. This man, though, looked like he had just walked in off the street after a game of basketball. The man paused just inside the door, glancing around with a relaxed smile. He didn't seem bothered by the noise or the rush. He simply waited for someone to notice him. Ryan sighed. He had a full section of tables to manage, and now he had to deal with someone who, in his opinion, might not even order much. "Can I help you?" Ryan asked, his tone more tired than welcoming. The man smiled politely. "Table for one, please." Ryan's eyes darted to the other waiters, but everyone was busy. He stepped forward, grabbing a menu without much enthusiasm. "Sure, follow me," he said, his voice clipped. As they walked, Ryan couldn't help but glance at the man's sneakers, a little worn. Not the kind he associated with someone spending big money here. The restaurant's lights glowed warmly, reflecting off the polished tables. The man seemed to notice the details, the soft music, the smell of fresh bread, the comfortable buzz of conversation. But Ryan was focused only on getting him seated quickly so he could return to his real customers. They reached a small table near the back. Ryan set the menu down with a dull thud. "Here you go," he said, already turning to leave. As he walked away, Ryan muttered under his breath, "Not exactly the fine dining type." He thought he said it quietly enough, but the man's slight pause suggested he had heard. The man's smile didn't fade. He simply sat down, opened the menu, and began reading. Ryan pushed the thought aside. The night was too busy for him to care about one table that probably wouldn't tip well. But as he hurried back to the main floor, something about the man stuck in his mind. There was a calm confidence in the way he sat there, like he belonged, even if, in Ryan's mind, he didn't. Meanwhile, the man watched the restaurant around him with quiet interest. Every waiter was rushing, every customer busy talking or eating. He didn't look impatient or annoyed by the lack of attention. Instead, he seemed to enjoy just being there, as if he knew something no one else did. Ryan didn't know it yet, but this man was no ordinary customer. This was Big Shaq, a name known all over the world, and more than that, he was the silent owner of the very restaurant Ryan worked in. The night was just beginning, but before it was over, Ryan's attitude, his assumptions, and his entire perspective on people would be shaken in a way he'd never forget. The hum of the restaurant carried on. The smell of roasted garlic and herbs filling the air, the chatter rising and falling like waves. Ryan moved quickly from table to table, unaware that the biggest twist of his career had just walked through the door, and was quietly waiting for the moment to change everything. Ryan returned to the man's table a few minutes later, still wearing that look of mild irritation he reserved for customers he thought wouldn't matter much. The restaurant was still buzzing. Now he didn't have the patience to play the friendly waiter role for someone he'd already judged in his mind. The man looked up from the menu, calm as ever. "I'll have the steak, medium rare, with mashed potatoes on the side," he said politely. Ryan scribbled the order, barely making eye contact. "Anything to drink?" "Just water. Thanks." That was the trigger. Ryan raised an eyebrow. In his experience, people who came to a high-end restaurant and ordered just water usually weren't planning on spending much. He didn't mean to let it slip, but his thoughts tumbled out in a muttered tone. "Right. Budget night, huh?" The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to cut through the soft music in the air. The man heard them. He didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly leaned back in his chair, a faint smile curling on his lips. Not the smile of someone amused, but the kind of smile you give when you're deciding whether or not to teach someone a lesson. Ryan, however, was already halfway to the kitchen, feeling oddly proud of himself for the jab. He thought the man would take the hint and maybe even leave early. What he didn't know was that each careless word he spoke was being tucked away in the man's memory, stacked like bricks for a reveal that would crush his confidence later that night. While waiting for his order, the man scanned the room. His eyes lingered on the polished wood counters, the neatly folded napkins, the framed photographs on the wall, some of which, interestingly, featured him with famous chefs and celebrities. No one seemed to notice. Or maybe they simply didn't believe it was him when Ryan returned with the steak. Set the plate down a little too quickly, the knife clinking against the edge. "There you go," he said, the words lacking any warmth. He didn't bother to check if the man needed anything else. But as he walked away, another waiter passing by gave the man a respectful nod, even whispering something under his breath. "That sounded like 'good to see you again, sir.'" The man returned the nod politely. Ryan didn't catch it, but if he had, it might have been his first clue that the person he had just insulted wasn't a nobody at all. The man picked up his fork, taking his time with the first bite, chewing slowly, his mind clearly. Somewhere else, Ryan thought he was just another customer passing through. The truth was, the man was quietly watching everything, every waiter, every detail, deciding exactly how this night was going to end, and for Ryan, the ending was going to be unforgettable. Ryan's shift rolled on, and the chaos of the evening didn't slow down. But for some reason, serving that tall stranger felt heavier than the rest of his tables. Every time Ryan passed by, the man seemed completely at ease, not scrolling through a phone, not looking bored, just quietly watching the restaurant. Like it was a stage and he knew how the play would end. The other waiters moved like clockwork, smiling at customers, exchanging small jokes with the kitchen staff. But Ryan, he kept his distance from the man's table. He told himself it was because he had too much to do, but deep down, something about the man's calmness made him uncomfortable, like the guy wasn't here to eat, but to see. When Ryan did return, it was with the least amount of effort possible. He refilled the water glass without a word, set down a bread basket without looking up, and walked away before the man could say thank you. The strange part? The man didn't seem bothered. He just smiled faintly and went back to his steak. From the corner of his eye, Ryan noticed something odd. One of the busboys walked past, and instead of ignoring the customer, he gave him a respectful nod, almost like a soldier greeting a general. Ryan brushed it off as nothing, but the moment stuck in his mind. A few minutes later, Ryan overheard two waitresses whispering near the drink station. "Is that him?" One murmured. "I think so." The other replied, glancing toward the man's table before quickly looking away. Ryan frowned. Him. Who were they talking about? He didn't ask. He didn't care, or at least, that's what he told himself. But the way the stranger carried himself, the subtle respect from some of the staff, and the small, knowing smile he wore, it all gave Ryan a strange feeling. Like this man wasn't just another customer, like he was somehow connected to this place in a way Ryan couldn't yet see, and without realizing it, Ryan was already walking straight toward the moment that would turn his night upside down. The moment the manager spotted him, everything in the restaurant seemed to shift. Mr. Collins, the manager, was usually a calm, unshakable man who didn't rattle easily. But now his eyes widened, his back straightened, and he smoothed his tie like he was about to greet royalty. Ryan noticed the change instantly. Just a few minutes ago, Mr. Collins had been scolding a new hire for spilling soup. Now, he was walking across the floor with a smile so polished it could have been printed on a billboard. His steps were brisk but respectful, and his gaze never left the tall man sitting quietly at the back. When he reached the table, Mr. Collins extended his hand. "Good evening, sir. What a pleasure to see you here tonight," he said warmly, almost bowing his head. The man returned the handshake, his smile easy. "Evening, Collins. Thought I'd drop by, see how things are running." Ryan froze mid-step. See how things are running. What kind of customer talked like that? Before Ryan could process it, Mr. Collins continued, "Please allow me to send out the chef's special on the house. And dessert, whatever you'd like. I'll make sure everything is perfect." The man chuckled. "I'm sure it already is." Ryan's confusion grew. He'd never seen Mr. Collins act this way with anyone, not even the food critics who sometimes visited. The respect, the warmth, the way the manager stood like a soldier before a general, it didn't make sense as Mr. Collins walked away. Ryan caught him giving a quick signal to the head chef. A moment later, the kitchen's energy changed to dishes for the stranger were suddenly being prepared with extra care. And a covered plate left the pass in record time. Ryan felt a twinge in his gut. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another diner. And whatever connection he had to the restaurant, it was big, but Ryan still had no idea that the truth would make his earlier words feel like a punch to the stomach. Asterisk, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation filled the air. But at the back table, something entirely different was unfolding. Ryan had just dropped off another plate for one of his other tables when he noticed Mr. Collins returning to the tall stranger, this time carrying a sleek black envelope. It wasn't a bill folder. It wasn't a menu. It was the kind of envelope Ryan had only seen passed between the manager and the restaurant's owners. Mr. Collins placed it gently on the table, lowering his voice. "These are the latest figures, sir. Sir. Not Mr., not Buddy, not sir. Like you'd say to a random customer, but sir, like it meant something." The man opened the envelope slowly, sliding out a set of documents. Ryan's curiosity pulled him closer as he pretended to wipe down a nearby table. He caught glimpses of what was inside, neat columns of numbers, graphs, and words like monthly revenue, operating costs, and profit margins. The stranger read through them with a calm, practiced focus, occasionally nodding. At one point, he took out a pen, signed at the bottom of a page, and handed it back to Mr. Collins without hesitation. Ryan's eyebrows knit together. Who signs restaurant documents in the middle of dinner? Collins thanked him, tucking the papers away like they were pure gold. "Everything looks solid, sir. As always, your vision keeps this place ahead of the game." Ryan's heart thudded. Your vision. The words hung in his head like a riddle he couldn't solve. The man simply smiled, picked up his fork again, and went back to eating as if nothing unusual had happened. But the air around him felt heavier now, charged with a quiet authority. Ryan didn't know it yet, but he had just witnessed the first crack in the wall, hiding the truth, and once that wall fell, it would crash right on top of him. Asterisk, the last bite of steak disappeared from the plate, and the tall stranger leaned back in his chair, folding the napkin neatly beside him. The way he moved was unhurried, deliberate, like a man who was never pressed for time because he owned the clock. Ryan noticed him out of the corner of his eye while rushing to refill water at another table. Something about the man's calm confidence still gnawed at him. He wasn't like the other customers. He wasn't trying to get attention, yet somehow, the whole room seemed to orbit around him without realizing it. Then, without warning, the stranger stood up. He was massive, his shadow stretching across the table, his head nearly grazing the hanging lights. Conversations in the nearby booths stuttered into silence. People looked up instinctively, not because of his height alone, but because of the presence he carried. He wasn't just in the room, he owned it. Ryan paused mid-step, holding a tray, his eyes fixed on the scene. He'd served celebrities. Before a few actors, a local politician, but none of them had the same quiet command this man did. And yet, Ryan still had no idea who he really was, Mr. Collins. The manager appeared like magic, straightening his tie as he approached. It wasn't the usual brisk managerial walk. This was measured, almost ceremonial. "Sir," he greeted, voice rich with respect. "It's always an honor." The stranger smiled faintly. His deep voice rolled through the room like slow thunder. "No, Collins. The honor's mine. I came tonight to see how things were running. And I'm pleased to say—" He paused, sweeping his gaze across the staff and diners. "Most of you are doing exactly what makes this place special." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. People leaned toward each other, whispering, "See how things were running?" Most of you. What was he talking about? Ryan felt his chest tighten. The man's eyes scanned the room again, his voice steady and clear. "For anyone who doesn't know, this isn't just a place I like to eat. This is my restaurant." It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere in the back. A couple sitting near the window looked at each other in disbelief. One of the waitresses gasped quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. His restaurant. The man continued, his tone still calm but carrying weight. "I've invested in this place because I believe in it. Believe in great food, and more importantly, I believe in how we treat people here. Every single guest deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like when they walk through that door." He let that sink in, the silence stretching. And then, without raising his voice, he said, "Most of you remembered that tonight." But his gaze shifted, locking on Ryan like a spotlight. Not everyone did. Ryan felt heat rush to his face. The words hit harder than any yell could. The stranger wasn't angry. That was the worst part. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, just a look. A calm, steady look that told Ryan the man had seen everything in that moment. Ryan wished he could rewind the night, erase every sarcastic tone, every muttered insult, every assumption he'd made. But it was too late. The truth was out, and now the entire room knew it too. Asterisk. Ryan stood frozen, his tray still in hand, though the weight of it no longer came from the plates it carried. The air in the restaurant felt heavy now, almost pressing down on his chest. Every pair of eyes seemed to be on him, though no one dared to speak. The stranger, the man Ryan now knew, owned the entire place, kept his gaze steady, not with fury, but with something far more unsettling. Quiet disappointment. The tall man stepped forward, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate strides. He wasn't looming in an aggressive way, but his presence filled the space like a tide coming in, impossible to ignore. Ryan's throat tightened. This was it. He'd crossed the wrong person. He was about to lose his job, maybe even in front of every customer. But then the man stopped, just a few feet away. His voice, when it came, was calm and deep. The kind that carried weight without needing to shout. You know. The man began, "I've been to hundreds of restaurants in my life. Some were small diners, some were five-star places like this. And in all of them, the food mattered. But the way people treated each other mattered more." Ryan's jaw clenched. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, to claim he'd been too busy, too stressed, too something. But no words came. The man's eyes softened slightly, though they never left Ryan's. "When I walked in tonight, I didn't expect special treatment. I don't need it. What I do expect is respect for everyone. Whether they look like they own the place, or whether they just saved enough money to eat out once in a year." The room stayed silent. Even the kitchen noise had dimmed, as though everyone was leaning in to listen. "You had a chance tonight," the man continued, "to make someone feel welcome. Instead, you made a judgment. You decided who I was before I even sat down." Ryan's face burned hot. In his head, he replayed every little moment: the sigh when the man asked for a table, the muttered comment about budget night, the lack of eye contact. Each memory landed like a stone in his gut. The man didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just let the truth settle between them. "We all make mistakes," he said finally. "What matters is whether we learn from them." Then he did something Ryan didn't expect. He placed a hand lightly on Ryan's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of power, but of understanding. "You're a good waiter. I've seen you move fast tonight, handle tough tables, keep the floor running. You've got skill, but skill without respect, that's not worth much." Ryan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I understand." "I hope you do," the man said, stepping back. "Because the next person you underestimate might not be as patient as I am." And with that, he turned toward the exit, greeting a few diners along the way as if nothing serious had just happened. The moment passed, but its weight stayed behind. Especially for Ryan, who knew that this lesson would follow him long after the restaurant's lights went dark that night. That night. After the last customer left and the chairs were stacked on tables, Ryan lingered in the quiet restaurant. The hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen was the only sound. The air still smelled faintly of garlic, steak, and fresh bread. But to Ryan, it carried something heavier, the memory of every word Big Shaq had spoken. He moved slowly as he wiped down the last table, his mind replaying the evening in sharp, unforgiving detail. The casual glance he'd given when Shaq walked in. The sigh, the muttered insult. The way he'd served the man like he was doing him a favor, instead of welcoming him. He could still see Shaq's eyes, calm but cutting. The kind of look that didn't need to yell to make you feel small. When Ryan clocked out and stepped into the cool night air, the city lights seemed dimmer. The walk home felt longer. He'd always thought of himself as a hard worker, someone who earned respect by moving fast, remembering orders, and keeping up with the chaos of a full house. But tonight had ripped the cover off a truth he didn't want to face. Skill meant nothing without heart. At home, he didn't turn on the TV. He didn't scroll his phone. He sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his hands. They were calloused from years of carrying trays, setting tables, and scrubbing dishes. But what had they done tonight? They had delivered plates without warmth, poured water without care, passed judgment instead of kindness. He thought about Shaq's words. "The next person you underestimate might not be as patient as I am." That wasn't just a warning, it was a gift, a second chance. Shaq could have embarrassed him in front of everyone, could have demanded he be fired, could have turned the whole restaurant against him. Instead, he'd chosen to teach. The lesson stung, but it sank deep. Ryan realized it wasn't just about Shaq. How many other customers had he dismissed in small ways? How many quiet insults had he slipped out when he thought no one could hear? How many times had he looked at someone and decided, in an instant, who they were? The more he thought about it, the more ashamed he felt. But shame alone wasn't enough. If he was going to make this right, if he was going to respect the second chance he'd been given, he had to change. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. The air still smelled of fresh cleaning solution, the floors gleaming under the lights. He tied his apron tighter than usual and took a moment to look around. Every table, every chair, every fork, they were all waiting for people who would walk in carrying their own stories. And it was his job to make them feel like they belonged. That night, and every night after, Ryan greeted each customer with the same warmth, whether they wore a suit, a hoodie, or something torn at the edges. He listened more. He smiled more. He asked questions, learned names. It wasn't fake. It was genuine, because he'd finally understood that everyone walking through those doors deserved to feel valued. And while most customers would never know about the night, he almost disrespected. The man who owned the restaurant, Ryan, would never forget. The lesson lived in him now, a quiet voice reminding him that respect wasn't earned by appearance, but given freely because it was the right thing to do. Years later, whenever someone asked him why he treated every diner like they were the top, why we are the most important person in the room, he would just smile and say, "Because once I almost forgot what really matters. And the man who owned the place reminded me." Months passed, and the memory of that night no longer burned in Ryan's chest like shame. Now it lived there as fuel. The restaurant had changed too, though not in ways a casual diner would notice. The smiles were warmer. The service was sharper, but not rushed. Even the new hires seemed to pick up on an unspoken rule. No matter who walked through those doors, they were to be treated like someone special. Ryan had quietly become one of the senior staff members. People came to him for advice, not just on how to handle a difficult table, but how to carry themselves when serving. Treat the first customer of the night like the last, and the last like the first, he'd tell them, and treat both like they might own the place. But the most unexpected change came one slow Tuesday evening. The restaurant wasn't full, just a handful of tables scattered across the floor. Ryan was setting down a plate for a young woman dining alone when the door opened and then walked Big Shaq again. It had been months, but Ryan recognized him instantly. That towering frame, that steady, easy smile. This time, there was no hesitation, no judgment. Ryan's steps carried him forward without a second thought. "Welcome back, sir." "It's good to see you," he said, and for the first time. It was true, not because Shaq was the owner, but because he was a guest. Shaq took a seat at the same table as before. "Looks like the place is still in good hands," he said, glancing around. Ryan felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. "We do our best, sir." They talked briefly about the restaurant, about the new menu items, about the small changes Ryan had introduced to make service smoother. Shaq listened, nodding occasionally. Then said something Ryan would never forget. "I wasn't sure you'd stick around after that night. Most people don't like being called out, even when they need it. But you stayed, you learned. That's rare." Ryan didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Before leaving, Shaq shook his hand, firm, steady, and added, "Keep doing what you're doing. People notice, even when you think they don't." When the door closed behind him, Ryan stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space Shaq had left. He realized then that the man's presence wasn't just about owning a building or signing paychecks. It was about shaping a place where respect was as much on the menu as the food itself. Years later, customers would still talk about how the service at that restaurant felt different, warmer, more human. They didn't know the story behind it, but Ryan did. And every night, as he walked through the doors to start another shift, he carried that story with him like a secret ingredient. Because the night he offended Big Shaq hadn't just changed his job. It had changed him. Forever? Asterisk, it had been 3 years since the night Ryan's world tilted. The restaurant had flourished in that time. The dining room had been renovated, the menu expanded, and the place had become known across the city not just for its food, but for its atmosphere. Warm, welcoming, and genuine. Regulars often said, it felt like the staff wanted you there, like you weren't just a customer, but a guest in someone's home. Ryan knew exactly where that came from. By now, he was no longer just a waiter. Shaq, who still dropped by now and then, had quietly promoted him to floor manager. It wasn't announced with speeches or champagne. One day, Colin simply handed him a new name tag and said, "From now on, you're running the floor. You've earned it." Ryan took the role seriously. He trained new hires personally, sharing the story of the man in the hoodie, though he never named names, and how that one night had taught him more about hospitality than all his years in the business combined. He told them, "Everyone at this table has a story you can't see. Don't assume you know it. Your job isn't just to serve food, it's to serve dignity." One chilly autumn evening, a group of tourists came in. Among them was a thin, elderly man with a worn coat and shoes that had clearly seen better days. A few younger staff members gave him quick, dismissive glances, the same kind Ryan used to give. Ryan caught it immediately. He stepped forward and greeted the man with the same warm tone he'd use for a VIP. "Welcome. We've got a table ready for you." The man's eyes softened as he sat down. He ordered the soup and a small salad, nothing fancy. Ryan made sure his bowl was full, the bread basket warm, the service unhurried. When the meal ended, the man called him over. "You don't know me, son, but I used to be a chef. Owned a place once. I've been to restaurants where they didn't even want me to sit down, but you." His voice caught, and he cleared his throat. "You made me feel like I mattered. Thank you." Ryan smiled, but inside, his chest tightened. The words took him straight back to that night with Shaq. The night he'd been on the other side of that moment. Later that week, Shaq stopped by again. They shared a quick handshake, and Ryan told him the story of the elderly man. Shaq listened, that familiar small smile curling on his lips. "And now you see," he said, "it's not just about the food. It's about the people who leave here, carrying something more than a full stomach." That night, Ryan locked up the restaurant, the city lights glowing outside the windows. He stood for a long moment in the empty dining room, thinking about how far he'd come from the waiter who judged a stranger in a hoodie to the man making sure no one else walked out feeling unseen. He knew the lesson would never fade. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was the restaurant's story. And as long as he was there, it would be passed on to every new server who walked through those doors. Because legacies aren't built in grand speeches or expensive renovations. Sometimes they're built in quiet moments, a handshake, a few words, and a choice to see someone for who they are, not what they look like. And all of it started with the night Ryan offended Big Shaq.